As we've been reporting, Election Day is just 14 days away, and voters on Native American reservations are racing against the clock to get their ballots in on time. A New York Times report found that the geographic isolation of many reservations is proving especially challenging this election year. Millions of Americans are expected to vote by mail, but post offices are hard to come by on the reservations, raising concerns that ballots there won't reach the county seat on time. Maggie Astor wrote that report and joins me now. She's a political reporter for the New York Times. Maggie, thank you so much for joining us. This is really eye-opening. Put this into context for us. What are the challenges voters on reservations face when trying to submit their ballots, not just in Arizona, but across the U.S.?
Well, a lot of Native American reservations are in very remote areas to start with. They don't necessarily have the same number of post offices, the same number of voting locations, the same number of any number of resources as more densely populated areas. And that can make it very difficult to cast a ballot either in person or by mail if you need to travel a long distance to get to that post office or to the polling place. Another issue is that oftentimes the roads are not necessarily easily drivable. They're not all paved. It can take more time and effort than the simple distance would indicate to get to that polling place or that post office.
And Maggie, tell us about how the pandemic this year is complicating efforts to try to mitigate some of those things that you just mentioned.
Well, for starters, it's made the obstacles themselves more difficult because many people on Native American reservations, like Americans everywhere in the country, are not comfortable voting in person during the pandemic. So there is more demand for vote by mail, and that means that problems like the inaccessibility of post offices or delays in mail delivery on reservations, those issues become much bigger and more urgent problems when a larger percentage of the reservation is planning to vote by mail. The other thing is that the sorts of organizing efforts that people, both tribal leaders and outside groups, might normally do to help people vote are themselves risky during the pandemic. Voter registration drives are obviously more of a risky proposition now than they would have been before the pandemic. Arranging rides or car sharing arrangements to get people to the polls or to the post office are riskier. And so not only is the problem itself more difficult, but the efforts to address it are themselves more difficult when it's dangerous for people to be in close proximity.
And Maggie, we're talking about tens of thousands of voters in the Navajo Nation that's just in Arizona alone. What would it actually mean if their ballots didn't arrive on time?
Well, currently, under current law, Arizona has a strict ballot receipt deadline. Ballots must be received by the county recorder's office by the end of Election Day, November 3rd. And because there are many mail delays for mail coming from the reservation, a ballot that is postmarked from the reservation even several days before the election might not necessarily arrive at the county recorder's office in time. And if it doesn't, that ballot would not be counted under current law. There are about 67,000 eligible voters on the Arizona portion of the reservation. The reservation also extends into New Mexico and Utah. But there are 67,000 just in the Arizona portion. And for context, in 2016, President Trump won Arizona by roughly 90,000, 91,000 votes statewide. The election this year is expected to be even closer than that. So 67,000 eligible voters in any part of the state is an extremely significant number in a state that is expected to be that competitive.
Well, a Native American voting rights group called Four Directions filed a lawsuit in Arizona to extend the deadline for counties to receive ballots from voters in the Navajo Nation until November 13th. What more can you tell us about this? What came out of that effort?
Well, the effort is ongoing. The group Four Directions is essentially arguing that uh, because there are so many mail delays on the reservation, uh, tribal members should have more time not to submit their ballots, but for those ballots to get from the reservation to the county office once they are mailed. Um, Four Directions did some test mailings before they filed this lawsuit. They found that mail sent, for example, from Scottsdale outside Phoenix to the county recorder's office there took less than 2 days to arrive, but mail sent from parts of the reservation took 6 to 10 days to arrive at the appropriate county recorder's office. So they asked a district court to require the Arizona Secretary of State to accept ballots received from the reservation by November 13th, as long as they are postmarked by November 3rd. The district court rejected that request. It went up to the Court of Appeals, which also rejected it on the basis that the plaintiffs didn't have standing to sue. And the organizers are still considering their next legal options, but as of this moment, the deadline is still November 3rd, and the courts have not ruled otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, the election is 2 weeks away. Realistically, can anything be done at this point to make sure these votes are counted? And how are voters on the reservation preparing in the event that further litigation is unsuccessful?
Well, uh, you're right. 2 weeks is not a lot of time for things to happen. Granted, uh, there is a fair bit of history of voting lawsuits being resolved very soon before elections. But certainly the tribal members and organizers are not counting on the lawsuit to help them. They are sort of organizing under the assumption that it won't. So, tribal leadership, the president of the Navajo Nation, Jonathan Nez, Four Directions, other outside groups, um, are organizing on the reservation to try to ensure that voters can get their ballots in on time, even if the deadline does remain November 3rd. Up until Arizona's voter registration deadline last week, these groups were working very hard on registering voters on the reservation. And now that registration deadline has passed, they are turning their focus to get out the vote efforts. This could involve transportation to the polls or to post offices. Obviously, this is more complicated in the pandemic to do safely, but it is something that they are trying to arrange in a safe way. There could be a sort of ride dispatch service that would take people to where they need to go to drop off their ballots. And really, right now, the organizers are, brainstorming to try to figure out what they can do in the time that's left. Tribal leaders certainly have been lobbying the counties. The Arizona portion of the reservation goes across 3 counties. They've been lobbying county leaders to add more ballot drop boxes and early voting locations to the reservation, which would create obviously more opportunities for people to drop off their ballots in less inconvenient locations. But it's really something that they're taking day by day, just seeing how much they can get done within the constraints of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it was really compelling, the bite here at the end, or the quote at the end from one of the organizers who says, quote, "All we're trying to do is bring equality like we were promised." Maggie Astor, Maggie, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.